Hi, this is Sunday evening, the 14th of March 2021. This is the Democratic Alliance Labour Report. Welcome once again for the weekly Democratic Alliance Labour Report. Please distribute this to all and sundry. I greatly appreciate that. I've had some enormous feedback on the previous ones, so thank you very much for the distribution. It's greatly appreciated. This week we look at the issue of the Compensation Fund amendments. They haven't gone through yet, except for one amendment that has gone through, and in particular this is to do with the domestic workers and their registration. It's very interesting what's happened, and it's got a long history to it. You will recall that under apartheid, domestic workers weren't recognized as workers at all. They were completely left out of the system. It was an iniquitous system. It was a real problem. Well, since 1994, the Democratic Alliance in its previous forms were calling for domestic workers to be recognized in our labor law. And to a large degree, they've started getting recognized under the UIF and many of the other pieces of legislation, but not compensation fund. So since 94, they've been talking about something of this nature, and for some reason or other, the current government did not want to include domestic workers under the compensation fund. The history of domestic workers has been fraught. They've had a bad history, and of course, this is just one nail in the coffin of the bad history of domestic workers in South Africa. So, it came to the current regime. And during the Fourth Parliament, when I was in the Fourth Parliament, I did call upon the then Minister to consider bringing domestic workers into the Compensation Fund. That was Minister Mildred Oliphant, if you recall. They did promise they were looking into it, they were going to do something about it, but like always, the ANC government did absolutely nothing. I'm not sure why they were punishing the domestic workers, but they did absolutely nothing at the time. There's also another issue that's still being debated, and we're going to look for comment on this, and that is that the fund itself is looking to try and ban third parties from acting on behalf of injured parties to claim their monies from the compensation fund. For instance, doctors, hospitals, chemists, anyone that supplies to people who have been injured in terms of occupational injuries normally go to a third party to give them the money up front and then claim in turn from the compensation fund. Those third parties, there are a few of them, have been quite successful. As you know, it's notorious that you can't get your monies out of the compensation fund. They have been completely dysfunctional. Anyone can tell you that employs staff that try and get money back from the compensation fund is an impossible task. It's like trying to get barnacles off a rock, but the third parties have been successful, and of course because of the success and because they have taken the compensation fund to court on various occasions, the government is now desperately trying to ban the third parties from do that. So thank you once again for listening. I'm Michael Bagram, the Labour spokesperson for the Democratic Alliance. It's the 14th of March 2021, a Sunday evening. Well, the Compensation Fund Commissioner, Mr. Vuyo Mafata, has in fact sent out a notice in the Government Gazette, Notice 106 of 2021, which became live on the 10th of March 21. And in fact, it said that the registration of domestic workers is retrospective since April 1994. So this is actually very weird. Very seldom do we see legislation that is retrospective. But because the Constitutional Court said that it has to be retrospective, the Constitutional Court forced the hand of government. They're not doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. They're not doing this because they heard from the opposition party that they have to do it. We've been calling for it for years, as you know. They're now being forced by the Constitutional Court to see it, and of course it's been made retrospective, so it's come back to bite them. But it's good news for domestic workers. You will all recall the story that there was a domestic worker that died at work, during accident at work. Her daughter, Mashlangu, decided then to take on the battle on behalf of her deceased mother and has worked it all the way through all the courts, from the Labour Court through to the Supreme Court of Appeal and now to the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court has finally ruled that domestic workers have to be registered, they are entitled to their claims, and it's going to be backdated as well. So it's a very interesting situation where government now is forced to do something with our courts once again. And we see this often enough, that you have a thing called lawfare as opposed to warfare. Something that the Democratic Alliance has been doing also for the last few years, where we conduct court cases. If we can't get something through by voting power, we get it through the courts itself. So now they are covered by the Compensation Fund for Occupational Injuries and Diseases. These injuries and diseases obviously have to be contracted whilst on duty. But if you want me to give you the forms for registration, the forms for claims, or just some of the background to this, I'm happy to email anyone who emails me. My email address is Michael, Michael, @Bagraims, BAGRAIMS, M for Mary, S for sugar.co.za. Email me and I'll email you the background document plus the forms. Everyone who employs anyone in a domestic household would be well placed to actually read this and to register, both obviously for the UIF, and we found during the pandemic there are many thousands of domestic workers who are not registered for UIF. That's absolutely vital you do that, and that in turn now you have to register, it's compulsory, register anyone working in a private household for UIF and Compensation Fund. So contact me on the email address and I will send it to you. Or of course what you could do is you could go to www.gpw.gov.za or www.labour.gov. Go to one of those websites, you'll probably find the forms on there. They're not entirely functional, but I have been on and they are there, so do that. Domestic workers are defined as any person who is entered into or works under a contract of service, apprenticeship, learnership with an employer, whether the contract is express or implied, with an employer again in writing, and whether the remuneration is calculated by time or by work or in cash or in kind. That's a domestic worker. And as long as it's a private household, it could be a gardener as well, that's in a private household, a chauffeur, butler, anyone who works in that private household is covered by the legislation. So please look at this carefully. Everyone who is in a private household employs someone, this law is for them. All these people in the private household are entitled to exactly the same benefits as anyone else. If you work in a factory or in an office, they now recognize domestic workers like any other employee in South Africa. Please do that. They're all entitled to those same benefits. And they're covered for temporary disablement, permanent disablement. They can even get a lump sum if a disablement is from an accident at work, or even if they die as a result of some sort of injury or disease, occupational industry, they can claim. You can also claim for funeral expenses, for instance. The family can do that. The schedules to the legislation have been outlined very carefully. For instance, a death benefit at the moment is 18,250 Rand for the funeral. So at least it would cover for the funeral expenses, and it's important for people to know this. There's also a widow's lump sum. A widow can claim a lump sum. A widow can claim a pension. A child under the 18, or when they get married, obviously they no longer can claim, or if they've been financially emancipated, they can't claim. But if they haven't been married or financially emancipated under the age of 18, they have a claim for a deceased parent who worked in a private household. Have a look at this, because at least then they can't sue you as the employer. They have to go to the compensation fund. So it gives you some measure of protection as well. The compensation fund itself also runs a program, a return to work. If someone is injured, they help you, they train you, they give you more skills. And of course you can apply for a disability pension as well. You must register. Please remember that. If the message comes out at all, you have to register, you as the employer and the employee itself. Domestic workers have had a long and hard history. Let's protect them, at least now the legislation helps. So thank you once again for listening to me. It's Michael Bagram, Labour spokesperson, Democratic Alliance, Sunday evening, the 14th of March 21. I really appreciate it. Have a good week.